Welcome to episode 81 of the Mountain Mantras Wellness and Life Lessons podcast. This podcast aims to inspire you with wellness and performance tips that you can incorporate into your daily life. I'm your host, Catherine Gaillet. Please learn more about my work at makeeverythingfun.com. My guest today is Dr. David Grand. David Grand, PhD, is a personal hero to me, and I know he is a hero to many others in the world. As the developer of Brainspotting, the groundbreaking relational brain-body mindfulness-based modality that I have been exploring on this podcast, I think for the last 20 or so episodes, David has been a change agent in the world. He is here today to talk to us about existential trauma and much more, and really how we can better understand our limbic systems in order to manage these challenging times. Thank you so much, David, for joining us today.
My pleasure, Catherine.
So where would you like to get started, David? There's so much to talk about. I'm going to let you pick our starting point.
Well, instead of getting technical and talking about limbic system, which we'll get to, I want to just start real human, okay? And I'll start with myself. My office is in Manhattan, and I live on Long Island, New York. And I haven't been in my office for 3 weeks because it's not safe for me to sit with clients, not safe for them, not safe for me. So I'm out of my element. Right now, I'm up in my bedroom upstairs in my townhouse. This is where I've been doing sessions remotely, video and telephone. And it's speaking for myself. I'm completely out of my structure and schedule and element. I'm doing everything I have to. I'm doing fine, but if we really go back to 3 weeks ago, now, and again, people will be watching this going to the future, but 3 weeks ago is when it really went from a Thursday to a Friday, when everything was kind of teetering and kind of okay, to Friday when it was definitely not okay. That was a time of change for us. Last week's really seems like 3 months or 3 years, which is time distortion, which also is a limbic kind of experience. When your neocortex is the part of the brain that really has the time orientation, and the limbic system, which is the mammalian brain and the brainstem, really does not. So when it feels like time is really distorted, it's because your more consciousness is more taken over by the subcortex, the areas below the neocortex. But everybody is in trauma shock. Everybody is feeling a sense of dissociation. It goes, you're either more on one side or the other, or going back and forth between shut down, dissociated, in denial, maybe with some level of depression, or the other side, which is being not just in a state of hypervigilance, but in a state of hypervigilance, which is certainly the case in terms of being afraid of catching the virus, or if you catch it, of ending up in dire straits like tragically too many people are. So that's, we're all in that, and as therapists are in that as much as anybody else, as much as their clients, as much as the general population. Therapists, despite what certain people think, are people first, and so it's a real struggle. It's a struggle for me, for you, struggle for all of us. And whatever issues you had before this, they are getting leaned on, and for the most part, getting leaned on big time. If you had a trauma history, this trauma is pressing on all of your prior traumas, going back to childhood traumas. If you have issues with anxiety, well, welcome to the wonderful world of anxiety for everybody, and for those people who carry anxiety conditions, to have it even more. Again, if you're vulnerable to depression, it's much more possible you're going to feel more depressed, especially if you're confined to your home and you've lost your whatever it is that you do outside of the home. So These are really, really challenging times, and part of it is that we're just in the early stages of it. We don't know exactly how long it's going to last. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. We don't know how and when we're getting out of it, and so that makes it impossible for us to truly get our bearings about the current situation.
Thank you, David, for clarifying for me what so many people are experiencing, which is this time distortion, and you explaining that it's due to us being in this subcortical part of our brain, not in the prefrontal neocortex, makes a lot of sense. I've heard so many people say to me, gosh, it's, today felt like 3 weeks, or, was that just on Tuesday? I mean, here in Sun Valley, where we have a extraordinarily high rate of COVID going on, and it's been very, very difficult on our system, our healthcare workers. We just had an earthquake on top of all that, and I was like, that was only 2 days ago. But David, you mentioned a few presentations around this traumatic experience that we're all going through. You mentioned dissociation, shutdown, denial, hypervigilance. I'm assuming we can shift back and forth among these, but anything that we can do to be aware of what state we might be in, and then how we might be able to manage that?
Well, and remember, I called it hypervigilance. Okay. Unfortunately, in our society, and for so many members of our society, hypervigilance is no longer an unusual state as opposed to vigilance. When you're usually in a state of hypervigilance and it's elevated, you literally go into what I call hypervigilance. How can we be aware? It's important for us to realize that dissociation takes us over without us realizing it. Okay, and dissociation means we're not really aware of what's going on inside of us or even around us. Now, it could be a massive dissociation where you just don't know where you are, but for the most part, that's not what's happening. It's some form of dissociation. And if any of you have ever had anesthesia, okay, or a test or a surgical procedure, okay, and then let's say it was not a surgery, but it was for some kind of test, a colonoscopy or something. They say for 24 hours, don't make important decisions. Okay, don't drive vehicles. What happens, that anesthesia state is a lot like dissociation, because you're going around and you're missing things, but you don't know that you're missing them. And that's the whole arc of dissociation, that you don't know you're dissociated. Okay, it may hit you when all of a sudden you go to the bathroom to brush your teeth, and then you realize you brushed your teeth already. So I mean that's when it kind of hits you. But in that post anesthesia state, you're going around thinking everything's okay when it's not, and you're missing all kinds of things. And especially if the anesthesiologist gave you a heavier dose, as some of them are wont to do. So the challenge is when you're dissociated, you don't really know that you're dissociated. People sometimes say, no, I'm fine, no, it's not me, I didn't, but it's really there. Even in terms of being in a state of hypervigilance, where you're, like paranoid, and nowadays, paranoia is normal. OCD is normal. It used to be that if you wash your hands 20 times a day, you had OCD. Now, if you wash your hands 20 times a day, then you're being careful and vigilant. Again, it used to be that if you were afraid that something was in the air and it was going to get you, if you touched something, that you'd get, something terrible would happen to you. Again, you were paranoid. Now, you're part of the population. So the hypervigilance is something that is hard to determine the difference between what is appropriate for the circumstances and what's not appropriate. And again, the more mindfully aware you are of this, the more you can begin to pick it up. But it's very, very hard to hold on nowadays. I went to the supermarket 2 weeks ago, and I had on gloves and I had on a mask. And hey, I'm not a germaphobe, but now I'm a virusophobe. But I don't even know whether it's more extreme than it should be, you know, but I don't want to get sick and I don't want to get deathly ill. So I was going around the supermarket there and I felt really anxious. Really, that's 2 weeks ago. I need to go back next week or so. There. Is that hypervigilance or is that this? No, we don't know. You know, that's part of what's so challenging about these circumstances. You really don't know what is overreacting and what's underreacting. Um, uh, because of the lack of testing, we don't know not only who's a carrier or not. We don't know if we're a carrier. You know, um, the idea of being afraid of getting the virus from somebody else is not the only thing we struggle with. There's the fear that of possibly giving the virus to somebody, especially a loved one or a friend. We don't really understand the COVID-19. You know, they're studying it and they're really making amazing progress with it. We really don't understand it. Say when you know, UPS drops a box of, you know, the virus can live on cardboard for up to 4 hours. Like, what does that mean? You know, like, so the driver might have it in space, might have touched the box. Where did he touch it on the box? And it's not gonna, if it actually happens and it doesn't, you know, it's not going to be fully active for 4 hours. It kind of degrades over time. So there's all these different things. But for us, we're told that in our vigilance, the hypervigilance, we go outside and we open up the box, we bring the stuff inside, we turn it away, we sanitize everything that was in the box. And we know whether it's partially necessary or really not necessary at all.
And David, I'm going to take a pause there. I know you switched, by the way, listeners and viewers, because of all the load on the system right now, there is a little bit of a delay. Is there a way, David, you could switch back to the Wi-Fi? Let's just see if it works a little bit better.
Okay. I was talking, so I didn't get drag or anything, so.
Okay, so I can't see you anymore.
Oh, you're not going to see me now. I'm on my settings.
Got it. Okay, I can hear you better though. That's fabulous. This is just such important information. I was getting it, but it was one of these things I was like, okay, can everybody hear this? And what you were just talking about.
You're dragging. I have to go back to what. Catherine?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, it was. You were just. That's what it sounded like. So, anything you want me to restate? Are you going to do this?
Yeah, we do have a little bit of a drag, and it might be also from my end as well. But it's this idea of hypervigilance and the idea that any underlying traumas or tendencies or issues that you had, they're going to be amplified by what's going on around you. You said something really that I wanted to kind of emphasize here, which is this is not a time to make big decisions, right? It's almost like we've, whether we're in our limbic systems or we're having trouble processing or we're disassociating or we're in denial or shut down, we are not functioning at the level where we should be making high-level executive decisions. So part of this, David, is about maybe only the biggest decision we can make at this point is how we can be better to ourselves and be better to our community to get through this as best as possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, and again, the challenge about not making important decisions is that you don't even realize that you're not of the right mind to do it. Okay, so you're more apt to do it. It's like if you ever see someone who's drunk, just drunk enough, and they think that they know what they're doing, and they don't know what they're doing. You try to tell, no, don't do that, don't say that, don't call this person, and so on. But but the person who's under the influence thinks it's fine, you know. Well, this is not exactly the same, but there's some parallels there. Um, uh, I do want to, you mentioned hypervigilance and prior trauma, and I want to address that because I think it's really important to understand the hypervigilance of the present time. What really is hypervigilance? Well, someone who's had a traumatic experience, let's just make it a simple one, a car accident. Okay. Now, normally vigilance is that we have a scanning system, that our senses are like picking up 360 degrees around us. Sight is the main one, but sound, smell, all these, and feel. And if you are in a car accident, okay, then after you come out of the trauma shock, you are going to be in a state of where you feel the chances of you getting into another car accident are greatly, intensified or amplified from what they truly are, especially if you go through the same intersection, or if any car is approaching you on the side where you were hit. Okay. That's so the idea that it's going to happen again is hypervigilance. And the idea that someone who drives, like, now they're grabbing onto the steering wheel like this and squeezing it and looking all around like this, that's a manifestation of hypervigilance. And what that really is in the brain is, when the brain is an amazing processing machine, and when you have a trauma, the processing machine gets overwhelmed, and pieces of the traumatic experience are left unprocessed in the brain, but they're not in the conscious thinking brain, they're in the subcortical brain. So that's what causes the hypervigilance, because the unprocessed trauma, it's just happened, it is happening, or it's just going to happen again. Okay. Again, someone who walks down the street who's ever been attacked on the street for a period of time, and sometimes for an extended period of time, is going to be looking over their shoulder all the time, even when it's noon and everybody's around and there's no problem. That's hypervigilance. But if you have childhood trauma, developmental trauma, then what happened is, as your nervous system was developing, it developed in such a way that it organized itself around being hypervigilant. If it was an abusive parent, or if it was, anything that causes a child to be traumatized, and it was an ongoing basis, it's not just like those little unprocessed trauma remnants in the brain. It's infiltrated throughout the entire brain. And for the adult who grew up in these circumstances, this is the only way to remain safe. Hypervigilance is the only way to remain safe. Okay, because they had to be hypervigilant back then. Okay, and because it's so infiltrated in the brain, now, even when they don't have to be, their brain, especially their primitive brain, feels very vulnerable and very endangered if it lets down on that hypervigilance. Okay, translate that over into March and April 2020. Okay, if that's the way the person's brain, ended up getting wired during childhood development, just think of how they're reacting now. It's like, it's either they're back in that same situation, or this is familiar territory. There are some survivors of childhood trauma who are really struggling now, more so because of the press of this, current existential trauma. But there's some survivors of childhood trauma who sort of have the attitude of, I got this, this is familiar territory to me. And when everybody else is freaking out, it's like it's not unfamiliar, and it's almost comfortable for them, at least compared to the rest of us.
That is so interesting. And I wonder at this point, if it's the time. It probably is not the time to try to go back and sort through our childhood experiences. But what you were talking about overall is this feeling of being unsafe, and being aware that that is a common feeling right now. So it speaks to me that we need to be very aware of others, right? I mean, we don't know what other people's existing or background childhood experiences are, and so to come to any judgment about how somebody is reacting to this. And you mentioned whether it's that they're like, oh, I'm comfortable and familiar here, or it's that they're freaking out because it's triggering something that goes way back. It's a way of, you always talk about perspective in the trainings for brain spotting, and I love that. And what this is really bringing up for me is it's about having a perspective of self, like really understanding that this goes way back, right? Because our whole life is important in consideration of what our current experience is, but also the perspective that we have on others. And overall, it's being more gentle and with that perspective. And certainly, I think with ourselves, getting to the answer of how do I make myself feel more safe in a very unsafe circumstance. Do you have any tips for increasing that sense of safety? I know I'm using brain spotting, and I just did that session with Deb Antonori that we're going to be sharing with self spotting. I immediately felt my heart rate go down and breathing slowed down and safety feelings went up. So that's one idea, but I wanted to put that out there as how do we feel more safe today?
In the simplest of terms, and this goes to mindfulness, it's to do anything we can to ground ourselves in the moment. Okay? Because when we're in the moment, we're okay. You're sitting over there in Idaho, sitting here in New York, and in this moment, we're both okay. The nature of getting destabilized, dysregulated, overwhelmed, all these things happens by not being in the moment. Okay? I like to say that trauma is an issue of being stuck in the then and there. And the healing of trauma brings a person from the then and there to the here and now. Okay? People who have depression tend to be stuck in the past, on an almost literal basis. People who have anxiety, they're stuck on it comes from the past, but it gets projected into the future. But all of that totally comes out of our natural time orientation. Mammals don't worry about stuff. Okay, like if you ever see a mammal, just a dog or a cat have a near miss or something like that, they're freaked out and so on. Then their system down regulates, and then they go on and in the moment, because it's over for them. They don't think about it because they don't have thinking apparatus in the brain. So again, we talk about the limbic system on one hand gets activated, by threat into flight or fight. It's not fight or flight. Mammals and humans don't look for fight. We look to escape. We only fight when there's no escape, when we're cornered. And then freeze, which actually is a complex concept. There's many different freeze if you can't flee, or you can't fight. But the limbic system is our mammalian heritage that actually can keep us in the moment. Because when the problem is that the neocortex gets into the thing of thinking about the past or projecting into the future, and it's all the anxiety that's coming from a system that is still activating. But just like the limbic system creates, the threat response, the limbic system also has the potential to downregulate or calm down the response and take us right to the moment. If you look at meditation, mindfulness, what it is you're just noticing what comes up next. It's just, you're observing your internal process. And that is in the moment. It takes you into the moment when you do that. And that we tend to meditation feeling more grounded or calm, and certainly in the moment. Because I'll speak to you, and speak for myself, speak to everybody who listens to this podcast. For the most right now, for the most part, we're okay. Okay, whatever has happened to us in the past is over. And whatever will happen in the future is yet to be. So right now, most of us are okay. And that's where we need to go. And anything that helps you to do that, activity, when your focus has to go into something to do something, you can't be thinking of all kinds of different things. You're focused on the activity, which is in the moment. distraction is good. You know, if you're concerned about this or that, or you've been watching television and for a day on the cable news channels, and it's all coronavirus, all the time. Well, that that puts you in a state of hypervigilance. But if you do something else, okay, if you have a task, if you need to clean up the kitchen or something like that, just getting up and going to clean the kitchen and doing that, it's not entirely mindless. It takes a certain amount of attention. Is it distracting? What it means is that parts of the brain that are projecting all kinds of stuff have to start to focus into the task of the moment. When it happens, the distraction takes you more into right now, and that's why it always helps. If you're with somebody who's really freaked out, the best thing you can do is to distract them. And they say, don't distract me, don't distract. It's good to be distracted.
And I'd love to talk about, I might turn off my camera, David, just to see if that saves on bandwidth a little bit, because I want to make sure that the audio comes through as clearly as possible. But this idea of staying in the present moment, because most of us are safe in the present moment, and avoiding that rumination of going into the past or projecting out to the future is such a powerful thing. Mm-hmm. It's one of these things that's so simple, yet so profound. And there might be some listeners or viewers that are saying, well, how? And you started to go there. You talked about, maybe stopping the news, right? We can talk about your recommendations for, how much news is enough. But then these distractions like cleaning the house, we can mindfully clean the house. I actually cleaned out my drawers this morning. It was great. But let's maybe brainstorm a little bit about things that people can do to distract that might be beneficial. I mean, distractions can be great.
Well, I will tell you, if you're watching television, okay, you turn away from what's focusing on what's going right now, and you turn to something that is engaging, even in a mindless way. I try to turn the cable channel car buff, so I put on the channel that has all these, finding cars, fixing cars up, selling cars, all those things. And when I'm watching that, if I get interested in it, it takes me away from all these other things. For some, if you have a movie channel, you go to the movie channel, and even if it's in the middle, you start watching. If you can get taken into the story, literally, the brain reconfigures itself when it's attending to something. Reading, if that's your invitation. Why do a lot of people read before they go to sleep? Because it takes their mind off of the issues of the day. It distracts you, it engages you. And the brain, instead of going down those neural pathways of worry, concern, anxiety, projecting into the future, reading forces you, especially when you get engaged, it forces you your brain to go down different neural pathways. That's really what distraction is on a brain basis. And physical activity, okay? It's kind of hard when you're supposed to be shut down in the house, but you can do exercise in the house, or you can go out, if you have social distancing, go for a walk, go for a run, so on. I'll give you another one. And it's nature, okay? And you can look at any part of nature. If the leaves are starting to come out now, the buds are starting to come out now. You go over to, let's say, a tree that has some young green leaves on it, You just look at the leaf. Let's say the leaf is 2 inches by 3 inches. And you just let yourself study all the detail of that leaf. As you do that, you get to see that there's a universe there in that one leaf. And it can, and nature is the best thing to take us out of ourselves. I like to, and I started doing this when I was a kid. I like to look at Earth, okay? I'll look at like this amount of Earth and just look at it and start to attend to what's there. and you start to see all kinds of different things that you never noticed, never thought about. You see activity. You may see a few insects crawling around. You'll see colors, and just this little earth. Um, there's so much for us to do in the world, in this universe, and we tend to just go down the same tracks over and over and over again. And we talk to people, we do the same things. Um, just, change brings us, a change of activity, change of thought, change of sensory experience takes us down different neural pathways and brings us into the moment without trying to.
So, David, I'm going to take us to a place in this interview I wasn't expecting to, but you talked about, looking at nature, slowing down. I can imagine parents are listening to this and are thinking that it would be great to send their kids out, maybe go out with their kids, pick up a piece of earth, and maybe this isn't something they've had time to do in the past. And that's kind of where I'm going with this. Is I understand that this is a very difficult time, and I'm not being a Pollyanna about it. I understand there is suffering and there's challenge and there's death. But there's also this, or let's just say, and no buts, and there is a paradigm shift occurring on this planet. And we're seeing it with the environment, with, many, cities seeing birds coming in, and, the marine life, and the smog clearing. But I also feel that for humanity, there's a potential shift where we are being reminded of certain things, like we are being reminded to slow down, to appreciate nature, to take care of our bodies, to stay in the present moment. And in this paradigm shift, David, I think it gives us all the possibility to think about who we want to be and how we want to be in this new world that is forming. And as a hero to so many people and change agent in the world, I wanted to hear your thoughts on how we might be thinking about this time as a way to step forward in a new and maybe better way as we go into this new paradigm.
Well, I'm going to use this moment to go to my discovery of Brainspotting, and then I'll bring it back to just what you've introduced here. It was in 2003, and I was working with an ice skater, and I was doing slow eye movements, which is another modality, although they did it fast. The fact that when her eyes started to wobble like this, the fact that I stopped there, I noticed it and just held it in place and then watched what happened from there, is what led to the discovery of Brainspotting, and has led to there being thousands of Brainspotting therapists around the world 17 years later. A later discovery, but it wasn't a discovery, it's right out there, is a client of mine was talking to me, and he's like locked on a spot. He's just looking at a spot like this. As people do in conversation, as we do, as people do, as clients doing therapy, as therapists doing therapy, must have been billions of times the therapist sat with people and they were looking like that, and they just didn't pay any attention to it or give any notice it, or if they noticed it, gave it no importance. To me, because I was working with eye physicians, I kind of had a sense, well, there's got to be a compelling reason why he's looking at that spot, and I encouraged them to keep looking at the spot, and he went into processing, and it was another way, that there was a third way of doing Brainspotting that sort of came from that. But to bring that back, so giving my own personal experience or experiences with how my just noticing things led to profound discoveries that's contributing to scores of thousands of people getting healing, in every continent. I have it's not my saying, but I like the saying, in adversity, there's opportunity. And this is certainly a time of adversity, but as you were citing, it's a time of opportunity. And, when you talk about the shift of what's going on now, and we're in the early stage of it, we're going to come out of this in a very different place than we went into it. And we can make it as positive as possible by how we frame it. Brainstorming with framing things and then holding the frame and up inside of that. This is like setting a frame for ourselves and then seeing what happens inside of that frame. And I think it boils down to priorities. You know, we all give priority to all kinds of things that are not that important or really no importance at all. Okay. But this is a time and an opportunity to reorder our priorities. Well, how do you do that? Well, when you're at home and you know, and if you go out, you have to stand 6 feet away from people. And your life, my life, your life, everybody's life is totally interrupted now. You know, some people talked about pause. Well, you know, there's some karmic pause button that's been hit. That's an opportunity for us. An opportunity for us to reflect, to shift our to notice, and to begin to see what's really important and what's not important. The things that bother people most of the time, that really aggravate us or cause us to worry, most of the time there's no consequence for, you know. Notice it because we're onto some other thing that's, you know, frustrating or worrying us. But in reality, you know, there's certain simple fundamentals about life and existence, and we've lost sight of them. Certainly in Western society, and I don't know, I can say in the urban areas, but rural areas also, we're all, you know, tracking it to one degree or another. And we need to slow down. We need to slow down and observe and think, reflect within ourselves, with us in relationship to others, whether it's another person or a group of people, a family, a group of friends, anything, you know, coworkers. The big question is what's really, you know, that's what I mean by priorities. What's really important? And, you know, we're being forced to see what's really important right now, but we can take the opportunity to go being forced to really start to go into a certain level of self-reflection. And we have more time to do it now, and we have the opportunity to do it now, and why not?
Yeah, if not now, when, right?
Great. Mm-hmm. Well, you know what? I want to tell you this. I come from the Hebraic tradition, and you just quoted the third part of a 3-part statement. Okay, I'm going to give you the first 2. It's if I am not for me, then who will be? That's part 1. Part 2, if I am only for myself, then what am I? And the third part you just quoted, which is if not now, when? That's literally, you know, comes out of something called the writings of our fathers. You can say our mothers too, certainly. If I am not for me, then who will be? If I am only for myself, then what? And if not now, when? There's a lot to think about with that, you know. And it's saying that we have to take care of ourselves. We have to take care of ourselves first, without becoming self-absorbed or without doing it to the degree that we're not concerned about others in our and the larger community. And there's no other time to do it than in the moment. If not now, when?
And that could almost be a mantra for people to think. If they haven't done a mindfulness or meditation practice, they could just sit with that, right? If not now, when?
Yeah.
And then sit down and actually, you know, like you said, observe, think about what's important. We've been forced to see what's important and what's not important. Mm-hmm. But this idea of being forced to slow down and think and observe and reflect is beautiful advice. And thank you, David, for bringing up that discovery of Brainspotting. I do want to spend a little I can't really have an interview with the founder of Brainspotting and not talk a little bit more about the modality, but you mentioned how it was discovered through that process of slowing down and observing, and not just brushing by what you observe, but instead being curious. And there's such a beautiful part of brain spotting, which is that, the wait and the being curious and keeping it opening and never assuming. So could we just spend a few minutes talking about how some of the brain spotting principles can be so relevant to what we're doing today in these times of slowing down, observing, and reflecting?
Well, the brain spotting principles are not solely or even primarily for psychotherapy. They are all issues of health, all issues of human life, and relationship as well. The fundamental the foundation of brain spotting is what we call the uncertainty principle, and it's neurobiological, but it's also kind of philosophical, maybe a little bit spiritual. The human nervous system has between 1 to 4 quadrillion synaptic connections. What is a quadrillion? If you take a billion and multiply it by a million, that's a big number. It's a number big we can't wrap our mind, and it's somewhere between 1 to 4 quadrillion synaptic connections on our nervous system. So if a therapist is sitting in front of a client, no matter how experienced they are and how knowledgeable they are and how intuitive they are, therapists can't know what's going on in that person unless it reveals itself from the person. And therapists were taught starting in school that we know certain things in order for this process to work. And in brain, you have to realize that can't know anything about their person, where they're from, where they're at, where they're heading, unless you sit with them in a way that you can follow them where they go. Okay, now, this is not just an issue for brain spotting, this is a relational issue. Okay? When we sit with a partner, parent, a child, a friend, coworker, and we think we know what they're thinking, they're feeling, we think we know why they're doing what they're doing. In truth, we don't, and we can't. Done the same thing 10 times in a row, and they did it in response to a certain stimulus, and this is the 11th time, and they're doing the exact same thing, and we think they're doing that because they always do that. Now, each event is independent, okay? But in human communication, people speak to what they think the other person is thinking or saying, and it's back and forth, and there's a drop-off that goes on back and forth, and most of what a person is saying doesn't come across or isn't received. And that's where we have breakdowns in communication all the time. But if you sit there, if you recognize that your parent has 4 quadrillion synaptic connections in their nervous, you're going to listen to them in a very different way. You become curious about where they're at and where they're really going and what's going on. And if you do this and you follow that person wherever they go, and you're really listening to them, they will go to a different place than you thought they would. We always get surprised when we take off our preconceptions and our expectations, and we're totally open to the other person. And when we do that, we're giving them an experience that they've probably never had before, never had with us. It's really the foundation of relational attunement. So this is the foundational principle in brain spotting. And so what do we do now? If a therapist is sitting in total uncertainty, what do? Well, we set and hold a frame with that person, which is just a way of being or a set of circumstances that then change the nature of where that person's nervous system goes, as opposed if we didn't do it. And we say in brain spotting, what do you do in the face of uncertainty? You frame it, okay? It's another way of saying that is you contextualize it. Well, when you recognize that if you're sitting with another person and you're really present with them and attuned to them and following them with no preconception, that's a relational frame. That's the core of all good psychotherapy, although most psychotherapists still come from a certain amount of certainty instead of complete uncertainty. But when you sit with a person that way, it changes the neurobiology, because it's just a usual kind of circumstance. And then when in that relational frame, you follow them wherever they go, they're going to go to some interesting places that you could not know, you couldn't possibly know, because it's uncertainty. But in brain spotting, because we use eye positions, we call them relevant eye positions, and we have 3 different ways of doing it. One is when a person's activated around an issue, you go across and you wait to see reflexes, like head snaps back, hard blinks, all kinds of things. When you stop there, okay, and the person's aware of whatever they're feeling in their body, that's we call it a neurobiological frame. The person's neurobiology is different than if you had found that reflex spot or the other kind of spots we have in brain spotting. That's the neurobiological frame that we superimpose on the relational frame. We call it the dual attunement frame. So that's the frame that we bring into the therapeutic relationship that causes there to be a change inside of that person's neurobiology, even though we don't know what it is. And then we follow that person inside of the frame wherever we go. We use the metaphor of a comet, that the client is the head of the comet and the therapist tries to get into the tail of the comet. And that means the tail has to always follow the head wherever it goes. So those are some of the fundamental principles of brain spotting. And they're really quite different. They have elements of all psychotherapies, but in toto, they're really quite different than any other psychotherapy because of that absolute, devotion and adherence to uncertainty.
And I'm so glad to hear the summary of the modality that, I'm always learning, and I've been to the 4 trainings and the intensive, and I plan to come back and do the master classes. And I love every time that I get to spend with you and your team. But hearing that from you in that concise description was fantastic. And it was so interesting too, David, how you brought this all together, because the beginning of this conversation, we were talking about uncertainty in the world, right? That we don't understand this virus. We don't understand how long it persists. We don't understand who's infected, who's been exposed. There's so much uncertainty that we discussed early. And then the idea that what makes brain spotting so unique as a modality is the idea that we are in uncertainty because that's when the magic happens. And maybe that's part of the answer to the question about what we can do in this paradigm shift is be okay with being uncertain, but sure, be curious, slow down, be mindful, pay attention. Some of the other things that you brought in to this conversation along the way, all of those things are great, but never with the idea that we have the answer. Because what is the foundational principle of brain spotting could potentially be the foundational principle of what will help us come through the other side of this whole thing. What about that for a crazy, profound idea?
It's both crazy and profound. The human response to feeling out of control, which is what uncertainty is to try to grab hold and take control. Okay, which usually is folly. Okay, and usually we do what I call faux control, FAU control, like false control. That might make us feel better temporarily, whatever, but we're not really controlling anything. But the whole thing of surrendering to uncertainty doesn't mean going out into the supermarket without a mask or gloves, but more on a internal, existential basis, surrendering to the uncertainty of the present and of really to life, can be a learning possibility for all of us.
Yes, I think we could all surrender a little bit more in these times. Well, David, and I know to call you David because the first time I met you, I came up to get my picture with you, and I'll have to put that in the post when I post this interview. But you said, you can take a picture with me, Catherine, but you have to call me David.
That's
So,
right. I remember that.
yeah. So, was there anything else that you wanted to cover or share with the audience before we conclude?
Uh, well, uh, one of the things, acceptance, self-empathy, and generosity, self-generosity. And that's a lifelong pursuit for me. And it's one of the things that makes me successful as a therapist is that I'm not afraid to make mistakes because I support, accept, and I'm generous with myself. What I do. When you're self-critical, or even worse, when you beat yourself up, it never works, never helps anything, and it's corrosive to ourself. Um, uh, but it's something that we all really need to work on, which is, and I'm not talking about the like when trying to repeat affirmations to yourself that generate self-acceptance, and it's an ongoing mindful process. It's a lifelong process um, to just realize that we are who we are, and we're trying to do our best, and sometimes we fail, and that's natural. Um, and self generosity means like if you make a mistake, is to like just accept it. It's like, and when you beat yourself up for making a mistake, you make the same mistake again. When you're generous with yourself and you say, okay, you made a mistake, it's okay, just learn from it, you can do better. And if you make the same mistake 10 times and you're still encouraging yourself and still generous with yourself, you have a chance of coming out of it and learning and growing from it. So that's something that I think we all need, and we always need it. We need it, especially now because we're crisis and we're out of our usual lives and we're afraid of what's happened to us and our loved ones. So really, self-support and self-generosity. It's something I preach because I pursue it within myself.
Thank you for that reminder. And generosity overall in terms of giving to others. I know you've been involved with the aftermath of 9/11 and some of the natural disasters, Hurricane Katrina. I'll put your full bio in the show notes, and of course with links to brainspotting.com. Any other places you'd like to send people to learn more about your work or Brainspotting as we conclude?
Uh, my website, brainspotting.com. If you Google Brainspotting, you'll see a lot. I have a YouTube video that was taken many years ago, so I look a lot younger in that. Called "It's What Is Brainspotting?" And there's a lot because we have such a large national and international community. There's a lot of stuff that's out there that's really interesting and valuable from other people, friends and colleagues. So I would look sort of in that direction. But I do want to mention, since you mentioned the humanitarian work, and I've done a lot in recent years in Newtown, Connecticut, where they had that horrific school shooting. I get a lot more out of working pro bono situations than I get for pay, even when I'm doing very caring, helping work. And I want to just share this, and really encourage others with this. What I get out of it is phenomenal. Okay, and I'm not going into it doing it to get this out of it, but it just kind of happens. I guess there's a spiritual aspect to this, that when you bring help to those who need it the most and wouldn't have it otherwise if you didn't bring it to them, we get more out of it than the people we give to, and that's just the way it is. That's what I've experienced over and over and over again, and it's the most valuable thing that I do, the most meaningful thing that I do, and the most renewing thing that I do. And I encourage everybody. And a simple act of kindness can be a humanitarian act, you know? Just saying something or helping somebody with one thing. You know, somebody's in the supermarket, and this is when you don't have social distancing, and there you see that the person is not tall in stature and that they can't reach something. Just to go over, say, you know, can I help you to get something, and get it for them? You give it to them. We get so much out of doing that, and you only know it by doing it and doing it repeatedly.
Thank you for that reminder. Yeah, we can all do so much to help our neighbors. And my mom is, organizing grocery delivery in her condominium area. So there's ways that we are physically distanced right now, but to still remain connected, I think is so important. And it's all about what you preach in your very important work. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all of this wisdom. I'm looking forward to seeing you in July in Denver for the International Brainspotting Conference.
Thank you for having me, Catherine. It's been my pleasure.